Hi everybody, welcome back. Glad you could tune in again. So let's get into the church covenant, which all members, all saints promise to commit to as an expression of our understanding of what it means to live faithfully as a disciple of Christ and as a member of the church. The first promise on the membership covenant goes like this. We promise, quote, to seek to live our lives in such a manner so as to bring honour to Christ and his church through the pursuit of holiness and peace with all men. Let's think about the pursuit of holiness for a moment or two. Notice that the way this is framed is that this is how we seek to bring honour to Christ and his church. I guess it's just a fairly straightforward observation, isn't it? Not only that godliness and holiness are the best ways for us to live, or that they are pleasing to God, although those you'd think would be sufficient motivations for us, but that the pursuit of holiness, Christian godliness, is a way in which Christ and his church are honoured. Honoured, that is, in the eyes of the watching world. What will the world think if it sees us? That's actually a legitimate question for us to ask, and it's a valuable question for us to ask. It's one that at the very least ought to stand alongside those other considerations in motivating us to godliness. Of course, this honour is in the sight of God himself as well. But let's not forget what the world thinks of Christ, what the world thinks of his church, will, to a very great extent, be shaped by what the world thinks of the way that we live our lives. And so we promise to strive for holiness, godliness, in order to bring honour to Christ and his church. Consider a couple of biblical texts that point in this direction. For example, Jesus remarks in John 13 that by this all people will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. Love for one another being the fulfillment of the second great commandment, to love your neighbour as yourself, and thus an aspect of fulfilling the law. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and love your neighbour as yourself. This is how people will be able to identify who the followers of Jesus are, Jesus says, by how we love one another. And of course, Jesus does not mean love in the kind of squishy, ill-defined, wishy-washy way that it's so often portrayed in contemporary culture. He doesn't mean love merely as an emotion. He means love both as an affection of our hearts and also as the disposition and actions that we take in our lives. And this is evident from the context in which Jesus says this. This is John 13. John 13 begins with the famous foot washing incident, which is the way in which Jesus shows what love means. You remember the episode during supper when the devil had already put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him. Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands and that he had come from God and was going back to God, rose from supper. Very climactic. He arose from supper. And what's he going to do as the Christ who has just risen physically, perhaps in an anticipation, in John's subtle use of language of his rising in resurrection? He laid aside his outer garments and taking a towel, tied it round his waist. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. Very painstaking, almost slightly laboured description of what Jesus did, designed to, like a kind of slow motion section of an action movie, to draw attention to these very significant actions. The familiar dispute arises. Peter says, well, you're not going to wash my feet. What do you think you're doing? And then Jesus says, well, if I don't wash your feet, you won't have any part with me. And so Peter typically goes slightly over the top. Well, wash my whole body as well as my feet. And Jesus, no, you don't need to have your whole body washed. You're already clean. I just need to wash your feet. And then he concludes, of course, verse 15, I've given you an example that you also should do as I have done to you. Wash one another's feet, which is a kind of archetype of the most unpleasant, thankless, unsought tasks in the ancient world. You know very well, I'm sure, how in the ancient world people didn't have deodorant and socks and nice stout boots to keep their feet clean. They would be dusty and dirty and sweaty from the semi-arid environment and from the dust and dirt and filth on the roads. And so they traipse into somebody's house, and the lowest slave in the household will be given the task of washing the feet of the guests. This is how you will show your love for one another, by undertaking the lowliest, most distasteful, servant-like, slave-like acts of service for one another. And this is how people will know that you're my disciples. Of course, it's always possible that we will think we know better, and we will seek to evade that responsibility. And in that case, we will discover, probably too late, that the denunciations that the prophet Ezekiel lays at the door of the Old Covenant people of Israel could just as easily be directed against us. In Ezekiel 36, verse 22, when the Lord begins to announce that he will act to save his people, he says, it's not for your sake that I'm going to do these things. I'm going to act for the sake of my holy name, which you have profaned among the nations to which you came. And he goes on several times in the following verses to describe how the people of Israel repeatedly have profaned the name of the Lord among the nations. That is to say, they've made it look like this God, the Lord, the living God, our God, is a despicable and unclean and even filthy being, because that's how they've treated one another, that's how they've treated his worship. And so that's really how they've taught the world to regard him. We have a choice before us. We could act in this way so as to make the Lord look despicable in the eyes of the world, or we could take up the towel, arise from supper while all the guests are still sitting, wrap it round our waists, metaphorically speaking, and go about servantly, slave-likely, if that's a word, serving one another, because we want to love one another as Jesus has loved us. That is what we have in mind when we promise to seek to live our lives in such a manner so as to bring honour to Christ and his church through the pursuit of holiness. The Lord bless you, and bye for now.